They told you America's story began with Columbus. They lied. Beneath the soil of the Mississippi Valley once rose a city so vast, so ruthless in its ambition, it dwarfed London, Paris, and Rome of its age. Cahokia, an empire of earth and fire, carved not in stone but in blood and clay. A city that erupted from nothing around the year 1050, swelling to tens of thousands in a single generation, a surge so violent archaeologists call it the Big Bang. Streets carved with precision, mounds rising like monuments to gods long buried. A grand pyramid monk's mound, its base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. At its heart, rituals that bent the sky itself, wood hinges marking the sun, blood rites binding the dead to the living. In Mound 72, bodies stacked like offerings, women arranged as if in eternal servitude, a ruler buried upon a throne of power and death. And then silence. By the 14th century, the city was gone. Not conquered, not remembered, swallowed. Its fields abandoned, its towers collapsed into green shadows. A civilization erased before Europe ever touched these shores. Yet its bones still breathe beneath modern highways and suburbs, whispering a history America was never meant to remember. In the shadow of modern St. Louis, beyond the steel bridges and the roar of highways, lies a silence older than the city itself. Beneath suburbs, industrial districts, and farmland rests the memory of a metropolis that once commanded the center of a continent. Its name is Cahokia, a city that rose 1,000 years ago on the floodplains of the Mississippi, a place so vast and organized that, at its height, it held more people than London in the year 1200. While Europe's cathedrals climbed skyward and castles bristled with battlements, in the heart of what is now the American Midwest, tens of thousands of people thrived in a city of earth, wood, and vision. It was not a scattered collection of villages. It was an urban center, planned, structured, monumental. And yet, for centuries, its existence was nearly erased from memory. Cahokia's sheer scale forces history to bend. Archaeologists estimate its peak population between 15,000 and 30,000 around the years 1050 to 1200. This was not a number spread across an entire region, but concentrated in a single place. To walk through Cahokia at its height would have been to pass through neighborhoods, open plazas, ceremonial avenues, and monumental structures that altered the landscape itself. The mounds were not random piles of earth. They were engineered platforms, layered with clay, sand, and topsoil in deliberate patterns that resisted erosion. More than 120 of them once punctuated the city, each with its own role, from elite residences and temples to burial sites and markers of authority. At the center rose Monk's Mound, the greatest earthwork in the Americas. Covering more than 14 acres at its base, it surpasses even the base of Egypt's Great Pyramid of Giza. For terraces climbed upward, reaching nearly 100 feet into the sky. Upon its summit once stood a massive wooden structure, interpreted as a temple or the residence of Cahokia's ruler. From the top, the entire city stretched out in every direction. The Grand Plaza, a vast open space larger than 35 football fields. Residential districts spreading beyond. Ceremonial mounds arranged in geometric precision. This was urban planning on a monumental scale, built without beasts of burden, metal tools, or wheels. Human hands carried every basket of earth, shaping the city through labor and will. What shocks most is not just Cahokia's size, but its age. Centuries before Europeans set foot in North America, before Columbus set sail in 1492, this city rose and thrived. By the time London's population reached perhaps 20,000, Cahokia had already surpassed it. Paris, one of Europe's largest cities in the 12th century, stood at around 25,000 numbers that placed Cahokia within the ranks of the world's great urban centers. To dismiss it as a minor settlement is to deny the weight of evidence beneath the soil. Yet for centuries, that denial was exactly what happened. Settlers who arrived in the region in the 18th and 19th centuries often ignored or destroyed the mounds, dismissing them as curiosities or worse, attributing them to a lost mound builder race instead of the ancestors of native peoples. In St. Louis itself, once called the Mound City, nearly every mound was leveled for brickmaking and development, leaving only a few survivors across the river. Cahokia's location was not accidental. The site sits at the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, arteries of trade and communication stretching across a continent. The floodplain provided fertile soil for maize agriculture, the crop that fueled the city's rise. Around 1050, there was a transformation often referred to as Cahokia's Big Bang. Within a generation, the population surged, monumental construction accelerated, and the city's layout was reshaped into a grand design. Archaeological surveys reveal neighborhoods arranged around plazas, connected by causeways and roads, suggesting centralized authority directing the city's expansion. The Grand Plaza itself was artificially leveled, requiring the movement of thousands of tons of earth to create a massive open stage for ritual and political display. At the same time, evidence points to Cahokia as a cosmological city, one aligned with the rhythms of the sky. Wooden post circles, known as woodhenges, were constructed on the western edge of the site, functioning as solar calendars. From their posts, observers could mark solstices and equinoxes, moments crucial for agriculture and ritual. This was a city bound not only to the earth but to the heavens, where power was reinforced by celestial order. The ruler atop Monk's Mound stood not just as a political leader but as a figure whose authority touched the sacred. Life within Cahokia was layered and complex. Farmers supplied maize, beans, and squash, sustaining the population. Artisans shaped shell beads, chert tools, and intricate pottery. Traders carried exotic materials from distant regions, copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. These goods passed through Cahokia's markets, feeding both its economy and its symbolic power. Mounds served as platforms for ceremonies and as tombs for the elite. Burials uncovered in the 20th century revealed staggering evidence of human sacrifice, particularly in Mound 72, where the remains of more than 270 people were found. Among them lay a man, possibly a ruler, placed on a bed of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon, a symbol of authority and warfare. Surrounding him were retainers, young women likely sacrificed to accompany him into death. Such acts demonstrate the intertwining of religion, power, and violence that sustained Cahokia's hierarchy. From the center of Monk's Mound, the ruler could look down upon a city that radiated power in every direction. Cahokia was not isolated. Its influence rippled outward, shaping the development of Mississippian culture across much of North America. Mound-building traditions spread, along with shared iconography, birds of prey, serpents, warriors wielding clubs. Communities hundreds of miles away reflected Cahokia's cultural reach. It was not simply a city. It was a capital of an entire world, its authority carried through ritual, trade, and fear. Yet, despite its magnitude, Cahokia fell into silence. By the time Europeans first reached the Mississippi Valley in the 16th century, the city had been abandoned for nearly 2 centuries. The reasons remain debated: environmental strain, deforestation, flooding, shifting climate during the Little Ice Age, or internal conflict. But whatever the cause, the collapse was total. A city once greater than any in its hemisphere north of Mexico dissolved, leaving only earthworks to testify to its existence. Today, Monk's Mound still rises above the Illinois plain, though its summit temple is long gone. Standing there, one can trace the outlines of the Grand Plaza, the faint shadows of mounds flattened by time and neglect. Beneath the soil of housing developments, parking lots, and highways, the remnants of neighborhoods still lie buried. To speak of Cahokia is to confront a truth long denied, that North America's history did not begin with European conquest, but with civilizations of staggering scale and ambition, whose stories were silenced, forgotten, and nearly erased. And yet the ground remembers, holding the imprint of a city that once rivaled the greatest capitals of the medieval world. The rise of Cahokia cannot be told as an isolated story, for it belongs to the wider world of the Mississippian culture, a civilization that grew out of the river valleys of what is now the eastern United States. This was not a land of deserts or mountains, but of fertile floodplains, winding rivers, and vast forests, a geography that provided both abundance and danger. The Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers carried people, goods, and ideas across thousands of miles, linking distant regions into a web of exchange. By 600 CE, communities along these waterways had already begun shaping a distinct way of life. They built villages anchored by small mounds, cultivated maize alongside native crops, and engaged in ritual practices that reflected a belief system rooted in earth and sky. These were the seeds of what would later grow into Cahokia. The centuries between 600 and 900 CE marked an age of transition. The introduction and expansion of maize agriculture altered everything. Maize, unlike native nuts and wild seeds, produced high yields that could be stored for long periods, ensuring food security in ways no foraging system could. Archaeological evidence shows that by 800 CE, maize was a staple crop throughout the Mississippi Valley, allowing communities to sustain larger populations and freeing some members from constant food production. Food surplus meant specialization. Craftsmen, ritual leaders, and political elites could emerge, shaping societies beyond subsistence living. The transformation was gradual, but the foundation was laid. Agriculture created the possibility of cities. Around the year 900, settlements in the American Bottom, a wide floodplain east of the Mississippi River near present-day St. Louis, began consolidating. Villages expanded, mound building accelerated, and populations concentrated more heavily in this fertile basin. Archaeological surveys reveal an increase in ceremonial activity and more complex social structures, suggesting leaders who could command labor for public works. But nothing prepared the region for what would erupt around 1050 CE, an event so sudden and transformative that researchers call it the Big Bang. The Big Bang of Cahokia was not a gradual swelling but a rapid and overwhelming explosion of urban life. In the span of just a few decades, between 1050 and 1100, Cahokia expanded into the largest city north of Mexico. Populations surged to between 15,000 and 30,000, numbers that rivaled or surpassed the leading European cities of the era. What had been scattered villages was reorganized into a structured urban core, complete with neighborhoods, causeways, plazas, and monumental mounds. This was not random growth. It was centralized, coordinated, and intentional. The construction of the Grand Plaza, a massive, artificially flattened space covering 50 acres, required moving hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of earth. Monk's Mound, at the city's heart, began its ascent during this same period, rising in stages until it dominated the landscape. The scale of these projects implies authority strong enough to mobilize thousands of laborers and a shared vision powerful enough to unite them. Agriculture lay at the center of this transformation. Cahokia's fields stretched across the fertile floodplain, producing vast quantities of maize. Farmers used techniques suited to the unpredictable flooding of the Mississippi, planting in the rich soils deposited by seasonal waters. The surplus from these harvests sustained not only the population but also the construction of monumental projects. Food was the currency that built Cahokia. With every stored kernel of maize, leaders fed laborers, reinforced loyalty, and fueled the engines of growth. The agricultural system was not simply subsistence. It was political, binding the people to their leaders through both necessity and ritual. This agricultural abundance allowed for an unprecedented degree of social complexity. Cahokia was not a loose aggregation of farmers, but a city with structure and hierarchy. Neighborhoods were arranged around smaller plazas, reflecting local communities within the larger urban framework. The city's layout suggests deliberate cosmological planning, with mounds and plazas aligned to cardinal directions, reinforcing the link between earthly order and celestial cycles. Leaders stood at the center of this structure, likely presenting themselves as intermediaries between the people and the forces of the cosmos. The evidence of central planning is unmistakable. Roads connected different districts, some elevated on causeways to withstand floods. Defensive palisades, constructed later, reveal both organization and the capacity for large-scale mobilization. Wood henges, circular arrangements of large posts, served as solar observatories, marking solstices and equinoxes, and tied agricultural cycles to ritual observances. These were not scattered constructions but integral parts of a citywide system, binding community life to celestial order and reinforcing the authority of those who claimed to interpret it. Social stratification grew alongside physical construction. At the top stood elites who lived atop the great mounds, commanding both spiritual and political authority. Their power was displayed not only in life but in death. Burial sites from this period reveal individuals interred with extraordinary wealth and surrounded by sacrificial victims, indicating a society where religion and politics were inseparable, and where authority was reinforced through spectacle and fear. Below them were artisans, whose skills in crafting shell ornaments, copper plates, and effigy vessels carried symbolic meaning across the Mississippian world. Farmers formed the base of society, providing the maize that sustained all others, their labor underpinning every achievement. Trade and communication linked Cahokia to distant regions. Exotic materials, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rockies, flowed into the city, evidence of vast networks of exchange. These goods were not merely practical but held symbolic power, reinforcing Cahokia's role as a cultural and economic hub. The city's influence radiated outward, shaping distant communities that adopted mound-building traditions and Mississippian iconography. Cahokia's rise was not confined to a single site. It represented the consolidation of a cultural sphere that stretched across much of eastern North America. What makes Cahokia's origins so striking is the speed and scale of its transformation. From a scattering of settlements in the 9th century, it became a metropolis in the 11th. The Big Bang was not just demographic but ideological, a shift in how people related to space, power, and the cosmos. Monumental architecture embodied authority, agriculture sustained it, and social organization ensured its continuation. The city was a physical manifestation of order imposed on landscape and people alike. The story of Cahokia's rise is also the story of human ambition on a continental scale. It demonstrates how fertile valleys and trade routes, when combined with surplus food and centralized power, can ignite rapid urban growth. The American bottom was not merely fertile soil. It was the stage on which a civilization emerged, capable of rivaling the greatest cities of its time. By 1100 CE, Cahokia had already claimed its place as the largest city north of Mexico. A city born not from conquest or colonization, but from the convergence of agriculture, belief, and human will. Cahokia was a city sculpted from the earth itself, a metropolis where soil became architecture and labor became monument. To walk its grounds in the 12th century was to see power translated into form, not through stone cathedrals or marble palaces, but through colossal mounds that dominated the horizon. Over 120 earthworks rose across the landscape, platforms, burial mounds, and ridgetop mounds, each constructed by human hands, basket by basket, load by load. Every rise of earth was intentional, an act of engineering and devotion that remade the Mississippi floodplain into a city that stood as the beating heart of the Mississippian world. At its center stood Monk's Mound, the largest earthen structure in the Americas and a feat of construction unmatched anywhere north of Mexico. Covering more than 14 acres at its base, larger than the footprint of the Great Pyramid of Giza, it towered nearly 100 feet above the plain. Built in successive stages, layer upon layer of earth carried from surrounding fields and riverbanks, the mound was a mountain made by human labor. Archaeological studies show it contains millions of cubic feet of soil, carefully arranged so that different clays and sands stabilized its massive bulk. On its summit once stood a timber building, likely a temple or council house, where rulers presided over ritual and authority. From this vantage point, the leader could gaze across a city of plazas and lesser mounds, each arranged in deliberate order, the landscape itself shaped to reflect the structure of society. Yet Monk's Mound was only the pinnacle of a vast system. Surrounding it stretched the Grand Plaza, an artificially leveled expanse of more than 50 acres, smoothed and reshaped by thousands of workers. This was no natural clearing. It was a stage for ceremonies, gatherings, and displays of power. The sheer effort required to flatten and maintain such a space testifies to central authority capable of mobilizing mass labor. Around the plaza, other platform mounds rose in symmetry, creating a monumental core that reflected both political order and cosmological meaning. Archaeologists have documented at least 120 mounds within Cahokia's urban area, each serving a distinct purpose. Platform mounds supported temples or elite residences. Burial mounds contain the remains of leaders and sacrificial victims, and ridgetop mounds marked boundaries or ceremonial functions. Together they formed a city where every elevation of earth was charged with meaning. The construction methods themselves reveal sophistication. Workers transported soil in woven baskets, carrying perhaps 50 pounds at a time. Millions of such trips built the great mounds, but their placement and composition show careful engineering. Different soils were layered to ensure drainage, and some mounds were reshaped or expanded over centuries, indicating both long-term planning and continual adaptation. Mound 72, for example, began as a simple ridgetop structure but later became a complex burial site. Excavations revealed the remains of more than 270 individuals within it, including a man laid on a bed of shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon, an unmistakable symbol of power and warrior ideology. Around him were mass graves, including dozens of young women sacrificed in a single event, evidence that mounds were not only architectural achievements but stages upon which ritual, hierarchy, and violence converged. Cahokia's monuments extended beyond earthworks. To the west of Monk's Mound stood the woodhenges, circular arrangements of massive wooden posts, rebuilt several times between 900 and 1100 CE. These timber circles functioned as solar observatories. By marking the rising and setting sun on solstices and equinoxes, they tied the agricultural calendar to the ritual calendar, linking the cycle of maize planting and harvest to cosmic order. Such structures illustrate the intimate relationship between engineering and cosmology in Cahokia. The city was not built for shelter alone, but to embody the universe, aligning human life with celestial rhythms. Urban planning stretched far beyond ceremonial cores. Roads and causeways connected districts, some elevated to withstand flooding, showing clear forethought in dealing with the challenges of the floodplain environment. The layout of neighborhoods suggests organized clusters around smaller plazas, each likely serving as community hubs within the larger city. Water management systems, including borrow pits and ditches, were incorporated into construction. These borrow pits provided soil for mounds and later filled with water, perhaps serving as fish ponds or symbolic landscapes. Even practical features carried layered meanings, blending subsistence with spirituality. The scale of coordination required for such projects reveals the city's social fabric. Tens of thousands of people had to be fed, organized, and directed. Labor was not random but structured, suggesting leaders with authority powerful enough to command or persuade vast numbers of workers. The placement of monuments reflects not only political power but a vision of the cosmos where the city itself became a microcosm of the universe. Archaeological evidence shows alignments of mounds and plazas with solstices, reinforcing the idea that Cahokia's architecture was inseparable from its cosmological beliefs. Each mound spoke to a specific function and meaning. Some, like the platform mounds surrounding the Grand Plaza, elevated the houses of elites, separating rulers both physically and symbolically from commoners who lived in wooden houses below. Others, like Mound 72, preserved the dead in ways that reinforced the living hierarchy, ensuring that the power of leaders was carried beyond death. Burial mounds often contained exotic materials brought from distant lands, shell beads from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rockies, linking Cahokia to a continent-wide network of exchange. The mounds, therefore, were both local and global repositories of meaning that extended Cahokia's reach across thousands of miles. What strikes most forcefully is the deliberate geometry of the city. The arrangement of Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, surrounding mounds, and woodhenges reflects a planned design, not a haphazard growth. Archaeologists note that the orientation of these features corresponds to cardinal directions, embedding cosmic order into the very structure of the city. This was not simply monumental construction. It was a city conceived as a cosmogram, a living diagram of the universe, where earthly power mirrored celestial forces. The engineering challenges alone underscore Cahokia's achievements. Without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals, They shaped millions of cubic feet of earth into enduring monuments. The labor force, drawn from a population of tens of thousands, worked under centralized direction to create structures that still stand a millennium later. Their longevity speaks to skill in construction, as careful layering of soils prevented collapse and erosion. Even today, Monk's Mound rises intact, its form enduring despite centuries of rain, floods, and human neglect. The city of mounds was more than architecture. It was the embodiment of a worldview. Every causeway, every plaza, every mound tied human society to the cosmos, politics to ritual, agriculture to time itself. Cahokia's builders were not simply moving soil. They were inscribing power, belief, and order into the landscape. The result was a city unlike any other in North America, a metropolis where the earth itself became monument, and where architecture spoke in the language of gods and rulers alike. Cahokia was not merely a city of earthworks and fields. It was a society bound together by power that claimed its legitimacy through the sacred, where rulers stood as mediators between the human and the divine. At the apex of this system was an elite class whose authority was expressed in architecture, ritual, and spectacle. The city itself was their stage, and every mound, plaza, and ceremony reinforced their control. Archaeological evidence points toward a theocratic form of rule, leaders whose political strength was inseparable from their role as religious figures. From the summit of Monk's Mound, the largest platform in North America, rulers could look down upon a city that was both physically and spiritually ordered beneath them. The building that crowned the mound was not simply a residence. It was a temple, a house of authority that fused governance with ritual. Cahokia's religion was written into its architecture. Temples on mound tops served as both ceremonial centers and symbols of elite dominance. The very act of climbing the terraces of a mound was a movement from the ordinary world to the sacred, reinforcing the distance between commoners and rulers. These spaces were not open to all. They were controlled, exclusive, and filled with ritual meaning. Archaeologists have uncovered post holes and remains of large wooden structures atop mounds, evidence of buildings that likely hosted ceremonies, councils, and offerings to spiritual powers. The cosmology of the Mississippian culture, as revealed in iconography and later traditions, centered on a tripartite universe, an upper world of sky and celestial beings, a middle world of humans, and a lower world of water and underworld forces. Leaders at Cahokia positioned themselves as the mediators of these realms, claiming authority that transcended earthly boundaries. This authority was not only symbolic, it was enforced through ritual acts that left traces in the soil. Nowhere is this more evident than in Mound 72, one of the most significant archaeological finds at Cahokia. Excavations revealed a burial complex that embodied both elite power and the brutal means by which it was upheld. At its center lay a man, interpreted by scholars as a figure of immense authority, placed on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads. The beads were arranged in the outline of a falcon, a symbol of warrior and leadership power in Mississippian iconography. His placement was deliberate, an unmistakable signal of status. Surrounding him were retainers and sacrifices, reinforcing that leadership extended beyond death, demanding the lives of others to accompany the ruler into the afterlife. The burials in Mound 72 went far beyond a single individual. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of more than 270 people. Among them were mass graves containing young women, many between 15 and 25 years old, buried in groups and showing signs of having been sacrificed. In one pit, more than 50 women were arranged in rows, suggesting they had been executed in a single event. Other pits contained men, some who showed evidence of violent deaths, perhaps executed captives or rivals. Nearby were retainers buried with the elite, their lives taken to serve in death what they had in life. These burials speak not only of ritual but of hierarchy enforced through violence and spectacle. Authority was not abstract. It was made visible in the blood and bones of those sacrificed to sustain it. Yet Cahokia society was not built solely on violence. It was structured in layers, a social pyramid that extended from the ruling elite down to the ordinary farmers who formed the backbone of the city. At the top, rulers and their families lived atop the great mounds, commanding both wealth and ritual authority. Below them were elites who oversaw districts, artisans skilled in producing symbolic goods, and traders who moved exotic materials into the city. Farmers formed the largest group, cultivating maize, beans, and squash in the fertile floodplain. Their labor sustained the population and enabled monumental construction. Outsiders, too, were present. Captives, migrants, and laborers drawn into Cahokia's orbit. Together, these layers formed a society where each group's role reinforced the whole, binding the city into a functioning system under elite control. Artisans occupied a critical place within this order. The goods they produced carried both practical and symbolic power. Shell gorgets, engraved with images of warriors, birds, and cosmological symbols, reflected the ideology of the ruling class. Copper plates, hammered from raw material obtained through long-distance trade, depicted supernatural beings and served as markers of elite status. Pottery, often effigy vessels shaped into animals and human forms, carried ritual meaning as well as utility. These items were not made in isolation but in workshops tied to elite patronage, their distribution reinforcing networks of authority and exchange. The farmers, while forming the base of society, were no less essential. Archaeological evidence shows that maize agriculture intensified around Cahokia after 1050, coinciding with the city's explosive growth. Fields stretched across the floodplain, providing surplus food that sustained both population and construction projects. Storage pits uncovered in residential areas reveal how maize was preserved and distributed, likely under the supervision of elites who controlled access to surplus. Food was not only sustenance, it was power, and control over maize meant control over people. Cahokia's magnetism extended far beyond its immediate residents. The scale of its monuments, the spectacle of its rituals, and the wealth of its markets drew people from distant regions. Isotopic studies of skeletal remains reveal individuals who had grown up hundreds of miles away, evidence that Cahokia was both a pilgrimage site and a center of migration. The city's influence radiated outward, shaping communities across the Mississippian world. Symbols associated with Cahokia appear as far away as Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and Florida, testifying to the reach of its ideology. People came to Cahokia not only to trade but to participate in rituals, to witness ceremonies, and perhaps to seek power within its orbit. The city's role as a hub is also evident in the flow of materials. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, obsidian from the Rockies, all passed through Cahokia's hands. These were not only raw materials but carriers of symbolic weight. Shells were carved into ornaments, copper hammered into effigies, mica cut into reflective sheets used in ritual. Each material carried the aura of its distant origin, reinforcing Cahokia's role as the center where the distant and the sacred converged. The society of Cahokia was therefore one of layers and contrasts. At its height, it stood as the largest city north of Mexico, a metropolis where religion and politics were fused, where authority was displayed through monumental architecture and human sacrifice, where artisans shaped symbols of power, farmers sustained thousands through agriculture, and outsiders were drawn into its orbit. Every aspect of life was tied to hierarchy, every structure to ritual, every act of power reinforced by ceremony and blood. Trade was the lifeblood that carried Cahokia far beyond the limits of its own fertile floodplain. The city, standing near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, sat at the perfect crossroads of North America, where waterways stretched like arteries into every direction of the continent. Goods, ideas, symbols, and people flowed into Cahokia, binding it to regions hundreds and even thousands of miles away. This was no isolated settlement hidden in the woods of a forgotten past. This was a city that commanded networks reaching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. The materials excavated from its mounds and plazas tell the story with undeniable clarity. Cahokia was not only a city of farmers and builders but also a hub of exchange, a magnet of influence that reshaped the cultural map of North America. At the center of this exchange were materials whose origins could not be mistaken. Archaeologists uncovered shells from the Gulf Coast, transported over vast distances and carved into delicate beads, or inlaid into ritual objects. These shells, highly valued for their symbolic and ceremonial use, linked Cahokia with the peoples of the Southeast, showing that the Mississippi River was not a barrier but a highway of connection. From the far north came copper, hammered into thin plates, crafted into ornaments, and cut into dazzling shapes. This copper could only have come from the Great Lakes, especially the rich deposits of the Lake Superior region, nearly 1,000 miles away. Its presence in Cahokia was not casual. It was shaped into sacred images, often depicting the themes of war, fertility, and cosmic power that defined Mississippian religious thought. From the distant Rocky Mountains came obsidian, volcanic glass sharp enough to slice flesh or shape into ritual blades. Its origins lay more than 1,000 miles to the west, yet it reached Cahokia's plazas and temples, proof of the vast reach of its influence. The movement of such goods was not random. It required organized exchange, relationships between distant communities, and a system that linked villages, towns, and regions into a continental network. Cahokia's central location allowed it to act as the great middle ground of this system, receiving, redistributing, and perhaps even controlling the flow of prestige goods that conferred both wealth and authority. The evidence of this trade is inseparable from the spread of cultural forms. The Mississippian way of life, its mounds, its plazas, its distinctive iconography, spread outward in every direction, echoing the rise of Cahokia itself. Across the Southeast and Midwest, communities adopted mound building, constructing earthen monuments in forms that reflected Cahokia's influence. The symbols that defined Mississippian art, the falcon warrior, the serpent, the hand with the eye in its palm, spread across the continent, binding distant peoples to a shared religious and cosmological system. These were not accidental borrowings. They reveal the cultural magnetism of Cahokia, whose prestige radiated outward like ripples across a vast body of water. Cahokia's artisans gave shape to this cultural force in objects that survive as fragments of a once thriving artistic world. Carved shell gorgets, circular pendants worn as symbols of identity and rank, carried images of warriors, deities, and cosmic beings. Their designs were not merely decorative. They embodied the mythology and ideology of Cahokian society, linking human action with divine order. Copper plates, hammered and cut with extraordinary skill, portrayed figures locked in combat, birds of prey with outstretched wings, or human forms radiating spiritual power. Effigy pottery, shaped into animals or human-like forms, carried the same symbolic weight. These works stand as evidence of Cahokia's ability to transform raw materials into powerful statements of meaning, projecting its worldview into the hands and homes of its people. The influence of Cahokia cannot be understood without placing it against the broader context of the world during its peak. Around 1100 CE, Cahokia was larger than London, Paris, or Rome of the same time. European capitals, struggling to recover from centuries of decline after the fall of Rome, were small, fragmented, and confined within their walls. London's population in the 12th century was perhaps 15,000. Paris, larger, may have reached 25,000. Cahokia at its height housed between 15,000 and 20,000 within the city itself, and tens of thousands more in its surrounding hinterlands, linked to the center by causeways, plazas, and carefully planned districts. Measured against its contemporaries, Cahokia was not a provincial outpost of some forgotten corner of the world, but one of the great urban centers of the medieval era. The comparison does not end with size. Cahokia's monumental construction, its massive earthen mounds, its carefully aligned wood hinges, rivaled the works of European cathedrals being raised in the same centuries. Where Europe turned to stone and towering spires, Cahokia sculpted the earth itself, raising monuments whose bases exceeded those of the Egyptian pyramids. Where European courts displayed wealth through imported silks and coins, Cahokia's leaders signaled authority through copper plates hammered from Great Lakes or seashell beads carried from the Gulf, and obsidian blades cut from mountains beyond the plains. In each case, these objects were not luxury goods for personal display alone. They were embedded in ritual and ideology, woven into the fabric of Cahokia's identity. The sheer reach of its trade networks underscores Cahokia's role as a global counterpart to these capitals. Though it lacked the written records of Europe, its material evidence speaks with equal clarity. The flow of goods to Cahokia reveals a city that shaped and was shaped by forces far beyond its own borders. Each shell bead, each copper plate, each obsidian blade carried stories of distant landscapes, distant peoples, and the ties that bound them together. The Mississippian world was never static. It was alive with exchange, and Cahokia was its beating heart. To speak of Cahokia's art and trade is to speak of a civilization that stood on equal ground with its contemporaries across the ocean. While kings and bishops in Europe ordered the building of cathedrals, Cahokia's rulers directed the raising of mounds and the crafting of sacred images. While trade routes carried spices from Asia to Mediterranean ports, rivers carried shells, copper, and obsidian into the hands of Cahokia's artisans. Both worlds were shaped by movement, exchange, and the power of symbols. Yet Cahokia remains obscured in memory, its story buried beneath centuries of silence. The artifacts unearthed from its earthwork tombs and ceremonial centers are more than relics. They are evidence of a city that drew the continent to itself, a city whose influence spread in every direction, a city whose power rested not only on its agricultural base but on its ability to connect, to influence, and to endure through networks that span thousands of miles. These connections ensured that Cahokia was not forgotten in its own time, even if its memory faded in later centuries. Its people lived within a world of movement and meaning, where every bead, every plate, every carved symbol tied them to a larger whole that stretched across the continent, binding them to a shared world of culture and belief. After centuries of dominance, the city that had risen from the floodplains of the Mississippi began to falter. Around the year 1200 CE, the Great Experiment of Cahokia, its massive mounds, its plazas, its palisades, and its population that once stretched into the tens of thousands, entered a period of decline that left scars still visible in the soil. The warning signs are preserved not in chronicles written by human hands, but in the earth itself. Layers of charcoal, deposits of silt, patterns of pollen, and the ruined skeletons of abandoned homes. Each clue tells the story of a city that could no longer hold its own weight. The people of Cahokia had long depended on their forests. Timber was essential, not just for homes and palisades, but for fuel, for tools, and for the massive wooden posts of the astronomical woodhenges. By the 12th century, evidence shows that the surrounding woodlands were stripped back drastically. Charcoal analysis from ancient hearths reveals a shift in fuel sources, moving from large hardwood trees to saplings and scrub, a clear sign of exhaustion. What once was an endless resource became stretched thin, forcing the inhabitants to range farther for supplies. As the forests receded, the soil that had anchored the floodplain grew vulnerable, washing away under heavy rains. Erosion crept in, filling streams and disrupting fields that had once fed the multitudes. Flooding compounded the strain. Sediment layers reveal episodes of destructive inundation, with the Mississippi River and its tributaries swelling unpredictably. Crops, the backbone of Cahokia's sustenance, were at the mercy of these waters. The intensive maize agriculture that had fueled the city's population was highly productive but fragile. A single poor harvest could ripple through the social fabric, and multiple years of failure could shake the foundation of trust between ruler and ruled. Scholars point to the onset of the Little Ice Age, subtle cooling beginning around the 13th century, that altered rainfall and growing seasons across the continent. For a society built on maize surpluses and large-scale feasting, the climate shift was not an abstraction but a direct threat to survival. Archaeology shows that the community responded with walls. Palisades of massive timber posts rose around the central precinct, enclosing Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza. First constructed around 1200 CE, the wall was rebuilt multiple times, each phase leaving behind trenches and post holes still visible to excavation. This was no symbolic enclosure, it was a fortification. Its presence tells of unrest, of conflict either within or beyond the city. A society confident in its power does not spend immense resources building walls. A society under pressure does. Whether the danger came from external enemies, tribes resentful of Cahokia's dominance, or from internal fracture, the meaning is clear. Stability was gone. The social order that had once held together through religion, feasting, and the monumental weight of the mounds began to unravel. Elites, who had commanded loyalty through ceremony and spectacle, could no longer guarantee abundance. The grand rituals atop mound-top temples required not only belief but also surplus, food, goods, labor. As those surpluses thinned, so too did the authority of the rulers. Archaeologists note shifts in the way mounds were used. Construction slowed, ceremonial deposits waned, and evidence of hasty or unfinished work suggests a decline in central power. By 1250 CE, signs of population loss emerge. Outlying villages and satellite communities shrank or were abandoned. Within Cahokia itself, once carefully planned neighborhoods show irregular rebuilding, houses placed in less orderly rows, suggesting breakdown in centralized urban planning. The city that had once held upward of 20,000 to perhaps 30,000 people, larger than London at the time, grew emptier. Each departure left behind structures that rotted and collapsed, their posts leaving dark stains in the soil, silent records of a vanishing populace. Violence too left its mark. Mass burials, trauma on skeletal remains, and hurried deposits point toward conflict. The palisades themselves speak of fear, rebuilt again and again as if danger never ceased. Archaeologists interpret this as either warfare with neighboring groups or internal uprisings. Perhaps peasants, artisans, or rival factions striking at a hierarchy that could no longer maintain cohesion. By the mid-14th century, Cahokia had largely been abandoned. Monk's Mound still towered over the landscape, its massive base a monument of earth and labor that no one dismantled but few maintained. The plazas that had once hosted feasts and ceremonies lay empty, their surfaces weathered by rain. Woodhenge's great posts decayed, falling into the soil one by one. The fields where maize once grew reverted to wild grasses. The forest, long driven back by human hands, crept forward again, reclaiming the scarred earth with relentless patience. The silence of abandonment was profound. For centuries, the floodplain had echoed with the noise of construction. Thousands carrying baskets of soil to raise mounds, priests chanting from atop platforms, families tending fires, children playing in packed neighborhoods. By 1350 CE, those sounds had faded. What remained were only traces: earthen monuments, broken pottery, scattered bones. To later generations, the site seemed inexplicable. The causes of collapse were many and interwoven. Environmental exhaustion, climatic shifts, flooding, and the overextension of resources set the stage. Social strain, conflict, and perhaps even rebellion delivered the final blows. A city built on a delicate balance of agriculture, labor, and belief could not withstand the mounting pressures. Unlike cities of stone, Cahokia structures were perishable, wood and thatch that did not endure once the people were gone. What endured were the mounds, silent witnesses to both the rise and the fall. For the centuries that followed, nature held dominion. Monk's Mound rose like a hill on the horizon, covered with grass and trees, its human origin obscured. Animals burrowed in its sides. Rain carved gullies through its slopes. The earthworks, once precise instruments of ceremony and power, became part of the landscape again. Yet within their form remained the memory of the city, a place where tens of thousands lived, where rulers commanded, where rituals bound society together, and where the stresses of environment and conflict eventually proved insurmountable. The collapse of Cahokia was not a sudden fall, but a long unraveling. From 1200 CE to 1350 CE, generation after generation bore witness to the shrinking of a world their ancestors had built. Children were born into a city already weakened, grew up watching walls rise and neighbors leave, and died in a place quieter than it had once been. Their story lingers in the soil, in the remnants of timber, in the layers of silt that mark flood and famine. And even in abandonment, Cahokia left an imprint so vast that centuries of silence could not erase it. When European settlers moved into the Mississippi Valley during the 18th and 19th centuries, they encountered a landscape marked by strange, massive earthworks. Some stood alone in quiet fields, others formed ridges, terraces, and artificial hills that dwarfed the farmhouses being built beside them. These were the remnants of Cahokia, though the settlers rarely gave them serious thought. Many attributed them to some vanished, lost race, refusing to believe that Native Americans could have constructed such monumental works. In their expansionist drive, the mounds became obstacles, and obstacles were destroyed. In St. Louis, just across the river from Cahokia, a complex of mounds nearly as vast as the main city itself was systematically leveled during the 19th century to make way for streets, housing, and factories. By the late 1800s, almost every mound in St. Louis had been scraped flat, carted away for fill, or obliterated by development. The city earned the ironic nickname Mound City, even as the very features that inspired the name were erased. For decades, Cahokia itself suffered the same fate. Farmers plowed across its mounds, leveling their slopes season after season. Roads cut through their bases. In some cases, mounds were quarried for soil. The largest of them all, Monk's Mound, survived largely by chance. Standing over 100 feet tall and covering more than 14 acres at its base, it was simply too massive to remove. But even it was not safe from degradation. Farmers dug furrows along its sides, erosion scarred its surface, and in the early 20th century, a road was laid across its base. By then, the once thriving metropolis had been reduced to silent earthworks, treated by many as curiosities rather than the remains of a city that had once rivaled London or Paris in size. It was only in the 20th century that scholars began to grasp the scale and significance of Cahokia. Archaeological efforts in the 1920s and 1930s revealed that these mounds were not natural formations or mere burial hills. They were carefully engineered structures, layered with soil, clay, and sod, each requiring immense human labor to construct. Excavations showed platforms where temples and elite residences once stood, burial chambers containing human remains, ceremonial plazas broad enough to gather thousands. In the 1960s and 1970s, systematic archaeological surveys transformed the understanding of the site. Radiocarbon dating placed Cahokia's peak between 1050 and 1200 CE. What had seemed like scattered mounds became visible as the framework of a massive urban center, planned and maintained with extraordinary coordination. The evidence was undeniable. Cahokia had been North America's first true city, a metropolis in every sense. Archaeologists uncovered Mound 72, a relatively modest ridge just southeast of Monk's Mound, and what lay inside shocked the academic world. Beneath its layers, excavators found a burial of a man of high status, laid upon a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Around him lay human sacrifices, dozens of women, their lives ended violently, buried alongside him in a testament to the city's ritual practices and the authority of its elite. Elsewhere, mass graves revealed entire groups of young people interred together, executed to accompany the dead into the afterlife. These discoveries revealed a society bound not only by agricultural labor and trade, but by religion, power, and spectacle on a scale previously unimagined for pre-Columbian North America. Cahokia was no rustic village. It was a complex, stratified society with leaders who commanded life and death. In 1964, Cahokia Mounds was designated a National Historic Landmark, acknowledging its significance. In 1982, UNESCO named it a World Heritage Site, placing it alongside the Pyramids of Egypt and the Great Wall of China as one of humanity's treasures. Yet even this recognition could not undo centuries of destruction. Out of more than 120 original mounds recorded at Cahokia, only 70 remain today. Countless others were destroyed before their secrets could be studied. The site once stretched across nearly 6 square miles, but highways, housing, and industry have eaten into its edges. The destruction of the St. Louis mounds remains one of the most tragic losses in American archaeology, erasing forever a vast urban district whose significance we can only guess. What survived, however, is enough to reshape the way history is told. Cahokia's rediscovery in the modern era forced historians to abandon the old myth that North America was an empty land before Columbus, a wilderness sparsely populated by wandering tribes. In truth, the Mississippi Valley hosted a city as complex, as ambitious, and as culturally significant as many of the capitals of Europe in the same centuries. At its height, around the year 1100, Cahokia may have had 15,000 to 20,000 residents, with tens of thousands more living in the surrounding region. London at that time was little larger. Paris was comparable. This was not a wilderness. It was a civilization, and it thrived long before European ships ever crossed the Atlantic. The recognition of Cahokia as a city of global significance forces a reckoning with how history has been told in the Americas. For centuries, narratives erased indigenous achievements, reducing vast societies to footnotes. The rediscovery of Cahokia's true nature demands acknowledgement that America's past is far older, richer, and more urban than the myths allowed. It demands recognition that indigenous peoples built not only villages but great cities, cultivated not only fields but entire landscapes, and imagined not only survival but greatness. Today, visitors who climb the steep steps of Monk's Mound stand on the remains of what was once a center of power, a city where thousands lived, worshipped, traded, and sacrificed. Beneath their feet are layers of history carved by hands long gone. Soil lifted basket by basket until it formed monuments that still defy time. Cahokia's legacy endures not in ruins of stone but in earth shaped with purpose. Its rediscovery is not simply the recovery of a lost city but the collapse of a false history that denied its existence. To stand at the site today is to feel the weight of what has been hidden and what has been lost, to sense the depth of America's forgotten urban past. A past written in the soil of the Mississippi Valley and carried forward in every mound that still rises from the ground.